If you were to click on this episode of Unsung Heroes based on only the thumbnail, you would be forgiven for thinking this is some kind of super obscure variant of a Corvette or a Plymouth, some kind of weird old American race car that most people haven't seen, that you could fully imagine, or at least I could, popping up completely randomly in either the Gran Turismo or Forza franchise as something really expensive concept car. You would be completely forgiven for thinking that. Then when you look at the title, though, and see the name Triumph, well, that might take you back a bit, because Triumph isn't really known for making cars that look like this. So what on earth is going on here? Well, the reason why the shape of this car and the style and the era is so familiar is actually because the guy who designed the vehicle has been in this series before with the episode about the BRE Hino Samurai, a very interesting little race car, and he is Peter Brock. And a number of classic racing enthusiasts will of course know that name, but for those who are unfamiliar, he designed at least a couple of cars that you probably are familiar with. He designed what would ultimately become the Corvette Stingray, and probably my single favourite design of his ever, the beautiful Shelby Daytona Cobra Coupe. Now this clearly has his design lines all over it, especially with that Shelby in mind. It's such a similar looking variant with their very small nose area, the swooping bonnet, the very straight back windscreen, but albeit with like an open top variation of a Daytona Cobra kind of shape, in some ways at least. Not necessarily quite as pretty at the back, but a lot of his designs kind of look like the back was an afterthought to some degree. And the goal behind the car was actually fairly simple, at least on paper. He wanted to have a Triumph built under the sanctioning of Triumph, which would race in the 12 hours of Sebring. A pretty interesting goal for a company like Triumph to have at the time, racing in America with a very un-Triumph-like machine, but it did have a lot of Triumph in its DNA. The chassis is Triumph, the engine is Triumph, and it also even combined that with not only American design, but also a lot of other great American racing components. The wheels on this car, for instance, were from Chaparral, who are kind of iconic for making race cars. The radiator is from a Corvette, and a lot of the ideas that they had for the machine were very good. The vehicle didn't weigh all that much, around 2,200 pounds. The engine is actually located 9 inches back in the chassis compared to the regular road-going TR250, which allowed for a much better weight distribution, and also, crucially to the design, a much smaller front end, which of course is more aerodynamic. Now, the engine is the least American thing about it, because it's not large. You would probably think, oh, it's got to have some kind of 4 or more litre, probably straight 8 or V8 or something like that, but actually no, it's a 6-cylinder, 2.5 litre Triumph engine, and as I said, it does use a Triumph chassis as well. Now, they had a very tight time frame to be able to build this vehicle, and one of the guys behind it, and incidentally the reason why the car is known as the 250K, was a guy by the name of R.W. Kasner, and he actually carried a hand-drawn rendering of this car, drawn of course by Peter Brock, back to England to show it to Triumph to get their permission and funding to build the car. And incidentally, what he also did, without telling Triumph beforehand, mind you, was go to Road and Track magazine and arrange with them for it to be a cover car on a future installment of the magazine. Now, Triumph had not even confirmed that they could do this yet, but he was clearly an enterprising guy, and Triumph did confirm and allow the design to be put forward. They gave them a $25,000 budget, which of course sounds like nothing now, but that was considerably more back then. Still not exactly what the bigger teams would have had, but decent enough, as it turns out, for what they needed to do. But even with the funding, it was very, very close. So much so, in fact, they only had time for 1 day of testing prior to travelling to Sebring for the event. Now, even that was the total opposite end of the country, because they tested the car at Willow Springs in California, and for those who don't know, Sebring is in Florida, so quite a way between the two. And when they did arrive at the event, they qualified with the car. Now, they initially had some cooling issues, but thankfully they were relatively minor as far as British reliability and all of that goes. They were able to fix that, and the car did ultimately qualify. Now, it didn't qualify amazingly well. It was 39th out of the 68 cars that started. 3-minute 20-second lap with an average speed of 93.5 miles per hour. So, of course, by today's standards, the numbers are much lower, but at the time, not awful. It wasn't the best, it wasn't the worst. It was on the lower mid-section of the grid. Unfortunately, though, and this really is, I think, the saddest part of the story when it comes to this car being an unsung hero, in the event, at around 2.5 hours in, one of those chaparral rear wheels, which had been incidentally modified to be fitted to the car, broke. In fact, it sheared, and that caused the car to spin out, and although it didn't damage any of the driving components in a conventional sense, no bodywork damage, no engine damage, it did damage the rear suspension, and unfortunately, they were not able to fix it. That ended the car's race, and unfortunately, as far as racing went, as far as I could find at least, ended its career. So, it's a sad end to a car which could have done so much more. And one of the reasons why I think it's so sad is because it reminds me of Toyota at Le Mans in the late 90s, where they were leading the event, lost because of a tyre blowout. Now, this one wasn't quite that bad, because of course they weren't leading anyway, but the reason why I think this one is sad, almost sadder than Toyota in a sense, is because a company like Triumph does not greenlight a vehicle like this to only do one race. They had to get their money's worth. So even if the TR250K hadn't have won the event, even if it had just finished middle of the grid, top of the grid, whatever, it would have been used again. It would have been raced again, probably in multiple locations, maybe even including England, and it would have been used far more extensively by Triumph as PR for the brand, because Triumph, let's be honest, love them or not, they don't exactly have a huge amount of cars of this design caliber in their roster. Most people don't think of something like this when they think of Triumph. So ultimately, I think it was a shame from that point of view. This could have easily become one of, if not the most iconic Triumph race cars of all time. But unfortunately, it wasn't really allowed that, because in the race, as I said, they weren't able to fix it, and ultimately Triumph, I guess, decided not to pursue it any further. Again, at least from what I could find. Now, they toured it around the country, showing it at different events, and today, as far as I know, and as far as the document which I've linked down below, or the webpage, it seems to be in a private collection. So from one point of view, at least the car is being treasured, but at the same time, it would be awfully nice if we could talk about it having more history than it actually did, especially when it's yet another design from the great Peter Brock, who I think actually is a great designer. Even if his cars don't always win races, they're some of the most iconic designs out there. And this one, along with the BRE Hino Samurai, just happen to be some of the more obscure ones that he's done. This, I think, is one of the coolest Triumphs ever built. Triumph isn't a brand that I talk about a huge amount on the channel, but I think this one is pretty stunning to look at. Overall, though, that's it for this installment. Of course, if you are new to Unsung Heroes, you should also click the link down below to jump over to the Discord chat for this channel, because you can vote over there for all of your favourite episodes of Unsung Heroes. And then, as I've said, for the 100th episode, we're counting down the community's top 10 favourites. So jump over there, vote for the ones you like, and of course, if you are new to Unsung Heroes, click the playlist here on screen to see all of the other installments. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.